Night has a way of changing how we listen. When the world slows and the noise thins out, ideas that would feel heavy or distant during the day begin to settle differently. They stop demanding attention and start inviting it. This story belongs to that quieter space, not because it promises secrets or revelations, but because it asks for patience. What follows is not about gods as spectacle or myths as puzzles to be solved. It is about presence, routine, and the quiet mechanics of existence as they were imagined at the very beginning of recorded thought. When most people hear the name Anunnaki, their minds jump ahead too quickly. They imagine beings descending from the sky, wielding impossible technologies, reshaping humanity in moments of drama and conflict. That version is loud, it is fast, and it is almost entirely modern. The oldest texts tell a slower story, one that unfolds not through conquest or wonder, but through obligation, repetition, and maintenance. A story where power is expressed not by freedom from need, but by responsibility within limits. To understand how the Anunnaki lived, we must first unlearn the idea that gods exist outside daily life. In the earliest Sumerian imagination, divinity was not removed from the rhythms of the world. It was embedded in them. The gods were not abstractions floating above existence. They were occupants of it, powerful, yes, enduring, certainly, but still bound to systems that required upkeep. Their authority depended not on omnipotence, but on continuity. The oldest tablets do not open with feasts or miracles. They open with structure, with divisions, heaven separated from earth, waters given their places, wind moving between realms. This is not creation as spectacle. It is creation as arrangement. The world is not summoned from nothing. It is organized from what already exists, and once organized, it does not run on its own. It requires oversight. This is where the Anunnaki enter the story, not as creators but as inheritors. They arrive into a cosmos that already has form but not yet stability. Rivers flow but flood unpredictably. Land exists but must be shaped. Life emerges but lacks rhythm. The world works, but it does not yet repeat itself smoothly. Repetition in this worldview is everything. Without it, nothing endures. The Anunnaki are not described as wandering freely across the heavens. They are introduced as members of an existing divine order, one that has responsibilities rather than privileges. Their role is not invention but enforcement, not inspiration but regulation. They are concerned with boundaries between life and death, order and chaos, continuity and collapse. This concern defines how they live. From the beginning, the texts imply something deeply counterintuitive to modern readers. The gods need things, not in the human sense of hunger or exhaustion, but in a structural sense. They require environments that are clean, controlled, and stable. They require time to be segmented. They require cycles to be maintained. They require nourishment. This is not metaphor. The tablets describe offerings in detail. Bread baked in specific quantities, beer brewed and measured. Animals selected by age and condition. These offerings are not symbolic gestures, they are provisions. They are recorded in inventories, tracked over time, adjusted according to calendar and circumstance. The language is administrative, not poetic. That alone tells us something essential. The gods were not imagined as beings who transcended material concerns entirely. They were imagined as beings who depended on order, and food was one of the primary expressions of that order. If the gods did not require nourishment, temples would not function as kitchens and storehouses. If the gods did not operate within time, there would be no emphasis on daily rituals, feast days, or seasonal observances. If the gods were not localized, there would be no need for designated spaces of contact. Yet all of these appear again and again in the texts, not as decoration but as necessity. Temples were not merely places of worship, they were functioning households. Grain was stored. Beer was brewed, livestock was kept. Bakers, brewers, herders, and cooks were employed. These roles existed because the gods were believed to receive and consume what was prepared. Divine life in this worldview required infrastructure. This immediately dismantles the modern fantasy of gods who exist beyond routine. The Anunnaki did not live above schedule, they lived within it. Offerings were delivered at specific times. Purity was maintained through repeated actions. Neglect was dangerous not because the gods were petty, but because the system itself depended on continuity. When offerings lapsed, the balance faltered, crops failed, illness spread, floods came at the wrong time. These were not punishments in a moral sense, they were breakdowns in maintenance. To understand what the Anunnaki ate, we must first understand where they lived. The texts do not place them in distant heavens removed from the world. They are associated with the earth and the underworld, with spaces beneath the surface, with judgment, fate, and continuity. These are not realms of adventure. They are realms of administration. They are quiet, regulated, and insulated from chaos. This positioning matters. It tells us that the Anunnaki were not imagined as explorers or conquerors. They were overseers, managers of balance rather than agents of change. Their environment was structured and controlled. It required upkeep, and that upkeep involved human participation. The foods offered to them reflect this role. Bread made from barley or emmer wheat, beer thick enough to be eaten rather than drunk, meat prepared according to ritual rules, dairy products, oils, fruits when available. These were not exotic substances. They were staples of early agricultural life, products of irrigation, seasonal planning, and labor. The gods did not require unknown materials. They required what humans already produced, but produced correctly and consistently. This tells us something profound. The Anunnaki did not exist apart from the world they governed. They were embedded within it. They did not wander, they resided. They had designated spaces. They withdrew not because they were absent, but because boundaries were necessary. Temples served as controlled points of contact. Inside them, divine life was sustained in a regulated manner. Outside them, human life unfolded with the understanding that divine attention could be drawn or withdrawn depending on behavior. The gods were not omnipresent, they were localized. Their presence depended on conditions. Cleanliness was not a moral abstraction, it was a physical requirement. Water was used for washing. Incense purified the air. Clothing followed strict rules. Disorder was dangerous because it threatened function. The Anunnaki, especially associated with judgment, could not operate in contaminated environments. Clarity required containment. This makes their lifestyle feel less alien and more administrative. They lived as overseers, not rulers in the theatrical sense. Their days were shaped by observation, deliberation, and the maintenance of cosmic function. Their sustenance reflected that role. Heavy foods associated with labor were for humans. Balanced, prepared foods were for gods. Not because gods were delicate, but because order demanded refinement. At this point, an uncomfortable realization begins to emerge. The Anunnaki were not beings who arrived suddenly, consumed resources violently, and departed without consequence. The texts describe continuity, not intrusion, integration, not domination, a long coexistence built on shared systems rather than technological superiority. This does not make them ordinary, it makes them constrained. And constraint is the key to understanding divine life in the Sumerian imagination. Before daily routines existed, before diets had meaning, existence itself functioned differently. The earliest layers of Sumerian thought describe a world that is ordered but not yet optimized. Heaven and earth are separated, waters are divided, light moves across the sky, but repetition has not yet taken hold. There is activity without schedule, presence without habit. In this early phase, there is no concept of meals as we understand them. Nourishment exists, but it is unstructured. There are no calendars dictating when gods must be fed, no rituals enforcing timing. The world provides directly. Water dominates the narrative. Clay forms bodies. Wind animates. Life emerges from environment rather than production. The gods in this phase do not sit down to eat. They do not receive offerings because offerings require systems, and systems have not yet stabilized. Sustenance is implied rather than described. The gods draw from the same environment that sustains all life. This is not scarcity, it is simplicity. This simplicity cannot last. As the world grows more complex, maintenance becomes work. Lesser gods are described digging canals, shaping land, performing physical labor. This labor marks a turning point. Existence has become demanding. Balance no longer maintains itself. Exhaustion appears in the divine realm, not as weakness but as signal. The system has grown beyond what it can support naturally. This is the moment when routine begins to form, not out of preference but necessity. Work requires energy. Energy requires nourishment. Nourishment requires reliable sources. Reliable sources require planning. Planning requires repetition. What begins as survival slowly becomes schedule. The Anunnaki emerge more clearly after this shift. They are not the ones digging canals. They occupy higher positions, but they exist within a system that now includes labor, provision, and rest. Their lives are no longer free of structure. They govern rather than create, judge rather than shape. Their existence becomes defined by role. This is when consumption starts to matter, not as indulgence, but as maintenance. The world now produces according to rules. Water must be guided. Crops must be planted, animals must be tended. Even gods who do not perform this labor depend on its results. Their authority depends on stability. Stability depends on nourishment. At this stage, the texts still do not describe detailed diets. There are no menus, no culinary flourishes, but there is awareness that sustenance must be managed. The divine realm is no longer self-sustaining. It relies on a functioning world. This reliance changes how the gods live. They become settled. They establish domains. They inhabit specific locations. Localization creates routine. Routine creates expectation. Expectation creates need. The Anunnaki associated with judgment and fate are especially affected. Their role requires continuity. Fate must be maintained without interruption. Judgment must be consistent. These functions cannot exist in a world without structure. They require predictable conditions. Predictable conditions require daily rhythms. As these rhythms form, the distinction between divine and human life narrows in unexpected ways, not in power but in process. Both realms now operate within time. Both require maintenance. Both depend on cycles of activity and rest. The difference lies in responsibility, not exemption. This is where modern interpretations often fail. The Anunnaki are powerful, but they are not outside the system. They are embedded within it. Their authority depends on it. Before routine existed, daily life had no meaning. After it emerges, routine becomes foundational. The creation of humanity accelerates this process. Humans are introduced as a solution to labor, not a moral act but an administrative one. The gods require relief. The system requires workers. Humans fill that role. With humans come agriculture, storage, preparation, and ritual. Fields are planted annually. Harvests follow seasons. Offerings are prepared daily. Temples become centers of constant activity. The divine world now has a regular interface with the human one, structured by time. For the Anunnaki, this means their existence becomes increasingly formalized. They are no longer simply present, they are scheduled. This does not diminish them, it defines them. What they eat, how they live, when they act, and when they withdraw all emerge from this progression, from a world without habit to one governed by repetition. From raw existence to managed stability, from direct sustenance to mediated nourishment. By the time the Anunnaki appear as recognizable figures, the world has already learned to feed itself, and that changes everything. Because from this point forward, food is no longer just nourishment, it is proof that labor continues, proof that order holds, proof that the system has not yet collapsed, and that proof must be delivered day after day without fail. What happens when proof fails is never described loudly. There are no sudden thunderclaps announcing divine displeasure, no immediate descent of punishment the moment an offering is missed. Instead, the texts describe something slower and far more unsettling. When maintenance breaks down, the world does not shatter at once. It begins to drift, crops falter subtly, rivers misbehave, illness spreads without clear cause, social order loosens. These are not framed as moral judgments. They are framed as symptoms. The system is losing calibration. This is the context in which divine nourishment takes on its full meaning. Food offered to the gods is not a gift meant to inspire gratitude. It is a stabilizing input into a complex structure. When the Anunnaki receive offerings, they are not indulging. They are remaining anchored. Their presence within the world depends on continuity, and continuity depends on repeated acts that confirm the system is still functioning. At this stage, it becomes clear that divine hunger, as imagined by the Sumerians, is not about emptiness of the body. It is about the vulnerability of order. The gods do not starve in the way humans do, but their ability to remain present, to judge, to maintain boundaries weakens when the structures that sustain them erode. Food is one of those structures, clean space is another, silence is another, time itself, correctly segmented and observed, is another. This is why neglect is so dangerous. Neglect does not provoke immediate retaliation. It invites gradual collapse. The gods withdraw not because they are offended, but because the conditions required for their presence no longer exist. Presence in a contaminated or disordered environment would undermine their authority. A judge who presides over chaos loses legitimacy. Withdrawal preserves clarity. The Anunnaki are especially bound by this logic. Their role is not to bless or nurture, it is to decide. Decisions made in unstable conditions are unreliable. Fate fixed amid disorder becomes meaningless. Therefore, the Anunnaki must remain insulated. Their lives are shaped by avoidance rather than engagement. They do not move freely among humans. They do not respond to every disturbance. They wait. Waiting is one of the least appreciated aspects of divine life in the Sumerian worldview. The gods wait for offerings to resume. They wait for rituals to be restored. They wait for humans to correct behavior. This waiting is not passive, it is evaluative. It allows patterns to emerge. A single lapse can be corrected. A sustained failure signals deeper imbalance. Judgment arrives only when waiting fails. This introduces a crucial idea. Divine action is delayed by design. Immediate intervention would prevent systems from revealing their weaknesses. By allowing imbalance to accumulate, the gods can distinguish between temporary disruption and structural failure. The Anunnaki, as guardians of fate, require this distinction. Fate cannot be adjusted constantly without losing coherence. It must be allowed to unfold until a threshold is reached. This threshold logic governs much of divine life. The gods do not micromanage, they govern by limits. Within those limits, humans act freely. Beyond them, consequences become inevitable. Food offerings, rituals, and cleanliness are tools humans use to remain within acceptable bounds. They do not guarantee comfort, they delay catastrophe. The Anunnakis' daily existence is therefore defined by restraint. They are not constantly active, they are not absent either. They exist in a state of readiness, monitoring the system without intruding upon it. Their sustenance supports this readiness. It does not energize action, it stabilizes potential. This perspective reframes divine meals entirely. Sacred meals are not events, they are maintenance cycles. They occur regardless of drama. They are repeated precisely because nothing dramatic should happen. Their success is measured by uneventfulness. A day without disaster is a day when maintenance has worked. The foods involved reinforce this logic. Bread and beer dominate offerings not because they are luxurious, but because they are predictable. Grain can be measured, fermentation can be timed, baking follows known processes. These foods embody control over time. They transform seasonal harvest into daily sustenance. For gods who depend on continuity, this transformation is essential. Beer in particular reveals how practical divine sustenance is imagined. Sumerian beer is thick, nourishing, and stable. It preserves grain in liquid form. It is safer than water. It represents successful management of resources. When the gods receive beer, they are receiving confirmation that humans have mastered time and transformation. That mastery supports order. Meat appears less frequently and with more restrictions. Animals require long-term care. Slaughter reduces future supply. Meat is powerful but destabilizing if overused. Its presence in offerings is regulated carefully. This caution reflects divine preference for sustainability over immediacy. The Anunnaki are not interested in abundance that threatens continuity. They favor balance that endures. This balance extends beyond food. It shapes divine space. The gods require environments free from excessive noise, decay, and intrusion. Noise in the texts is not mere sound, it is uncontrolled activity. Overpopulation, crowding, constant movement, noise represents systems operating beyond capacity. For beings concerned with limits, noise is a warning sign. When humans multiply too rapidly, the gods complain. This complaint is often misunderstood as irritation. It is not emotional annoyance. It is systemic strain. The environment cannot support unlimited growth. Divine attention becomes fragmented. Rest becomes impossible. The gods cannot withdraw properly. This threatens their function. The response to such strain is severe because it addresses accumulated imbalance, not isolated behavior. Floods and population reductions are resets, not punishments. They restore silence. Silence allows structure to reassert itself. Only then can divine life resume without distortion. This pattern reveals how divine rest functions. Rest is not leisure, it is recalibration. After intense intervention, the gods withdraw. They allow consequences to unfold without further adjustment. This withdrawal protects the integrity of their decisions. A judgment followed by constant interference loses authority. The Anunnaki exemplify this principle. They appear at moments of finality. After judgment, they recede. They do not explain, they do not negotiate. They allow outcomes to propagate. Their silence afterward is part of the decision itself. This rhythm of engagement and withdrawal defines divine days. There is no sense of endless activity. There is a cycle of attention, decision, retreat. This cycle mirrors the natural rhythms of the world: flood and recession, planting and harvest, life and death. The gods do not escape these rhythms, they embody them. This embodiment becomes especially clear in the underworld, where the Anunnaki are often associated. The underworld is not chaotic, it is regulated. It has gates, officials, procedures. Souls arrive, are assessed, and move on. There is no constant activity. Long periods pass between arrivals. The judges remain present but inactive. Their authority does not depend on constant action. It depends on availability. Availability without intrusion is the defining quality of Anunnaki power. They are there when needed, not when summoned. This distinction preserves hierarchy. Humans cannot compel judgment. They can only maintain conditions that delay it. The places where the gods reside reflect this logic. Divine homes are not spaces of indulgence. They are spaces of containment. Temples regulate access. Underworld realms enforce separation. Mountains and subterranean spaces limit approach. These locations protect divine identity from dilution. A god without boundaries cannot govern. Boundaries require place. Place requires withdrawal. The Anunnakis' residence in spaces removed from daily life ensures that their authority remains intact. They are not part of everyday exchange. They intervene only when necessary. This distance shapes human perception. When prayers go unanswered, it is not because the gods are absent. It is because they are waiting. Waiting preserves impartiality. Immediate response would collapse judgment into reaction. Ritual exists to manage this waiting. It does not guarantee response. It maintains alignment. By performing rituals correctly, humans demonstrate that the system still functions. The gods observe. They do not respond unless patterns fail. This observation-based governance explains why divine knowledge is mediated. The gods do not witness every act directly. Information travels upward through signs, omens, reports, and outcomes. This mirrors human administration. Kings receive reports. They do not see everything. Authority flows downward. Information flows upward. The Anunnaki operate similarly. They preside over a system that reveals its condition through symptoms. Crop failure, disease, social unrest, these are data points. They inform judgment. Direct surveillance is unnecessary and destabilizing. This mediated awareness reinforces limitation. The gods do not know everything instantly. They know what the system reveals. This does not diminish their authority. It situates it within order rather than above it. Within this framework, divine disagreement becomes understandable. The texts occasionally describe gods arguing or complaining. These moments are not evidence of weakness. They are evidence of constraint. When power operates within limits, tension arises. Different interpretations of when thresholds have been crossed lead to debate. The Anunnaki often appear as enforcers of decisions made collectively. They are not always the originators. This role carries weight but restricts freedom. Once consensus is reached, execution is mandatory. Duty overrides preference. This duty-driven existence strips divine life of glamour. There is little joy described, no endless feasting, no indulgence. There is repetition, vigilance, restraint. The gods endure not because they escape limitation, but because they respect it. This endurance requires renewal. After disruption, rituals resume, spaces are cleansed, offerings increase, silence returns. These acts restore divine equilibrium. They are not symbolic comforts, they are functional repairs. The Anunnaki, exposed repeatedly to moments of finality, require this restoration deeply. Judgment strains divine capacity. Withdrawal allows recovery. Recovery allows continued governance. The divine body, though rarely described, is implied to exist within space and time. Gods sit, they stand, they enter and exit, they consume. These actions imply embodiment. Embodiment implies vulnerability to environment. Clean spaces preserve function. Contaminated spaces degrade it. This is why ritual cleanliness is non-negotiable. It is not moral purity. It is boundary maintenance. Washing removes residue. Silence prevents intrusion. Correct speech preserves sequence. Sequence preserves order. Death represents the greatest boundary threat. It collapses categories. Rituals surrounding death are strict because improper contact risks contamination. The underworld is ordered precisely to contain this risk. The Anunnaki preside over these thresholds because their authority depends on boundaries holding. This fear of disorder underlies everything. Not fear as emotion, but as awareness. Systems collapse gradually. Ritual addresses the gradual phase. Judgment addresses the sudden one. Cleanliness, offerings, routine all exist to delay the need for judgment. This delay is mercy, though it is not framed as such. The gods prefer maintenance to catastrophe. The Anunnaki prefer never to act. Their action signals failure elsewhere. Understanding this transforms how divine life is imagined. The Anunnaki are not aloof tyrants. They are reluctant enforcers. Their distance is protective. Their silence is deliberate. Their sustenance supports vigilance, not indulgence. As human society stabilizes further, this logic intensifies. Institutions replace direct intervention. Law replaces judgment. Memory replaces presence. The gods withdraw more deeply, not because they weaken, but because the system strengthens. Offerings continue, but their meaning shifts. They no longer feed hungry gods. They sustain alignment. They remind humans of limits. They reinforce memory of consequence. This transition is gradual. There is no announcement. Shared tables fade into distant rituals. Presence thins into expectation. The gods are still there, but no longer familiar. The Anunnaki adapt to this distance naturally. Their authority does not depend on intimacy. It depends on inevitability. Their judgments arrive from silence, making them heavier, not lighter. By this point, divine life has changed form. Sustenance is no longer daily consumption. It is continued relevance. Homes are no longer visited. They are remembered. Judgment is no longer personal. It is systemic. This is not disappearance. It is consolidation. The gods no longer need to be present because their influence has become embedded. The world behaves as though they are watching even when they are not seen. This internalized authority is more effective than constant oversight. For the Anunnaki, this marks a final shift. They are no longer participants in daily ritual. They are principles that underlie it. Fate unfolds because they fixed it. Consequence arrives because they established it. Memory replaces encounter. Structure replaces presence. The gods do not leave the world. They become part of how it works. And it is here at this threshold between presence and memory that we will pause. Because what comes next is not about what the Anunnaki did, but about what happened once they no longer needed to. When the gods no longer need to be seen in order to govern, the nature of existence shifts quietly but permanently. The world does not announce this change. There is no ritual marking the moment when presence gives way to memory. Life simply continues under a new condition, one where consequence arrives without warning and order persists without reassurance. This is the phase in which the Anunnaki become most powerful, not because they act more, but because they act less. In earlier ages, divine attention was expected to be near. Offerings were made with the assumption that they were being received in real time. Ritual failure produced visible responses. There was a sense of proximity, of shared systems operating close enough to feel personal. But as institutions mature and routines stabilize, immediacy becomes unnecessary. The system learns how to carry itself. And when it does, divine presence begins to retreat into something quieter and far more enduring. This retreat is not abandonment, it is absorption. The authority of the Anunnaki does not vanish when they withdraw. It becomes embedded in patterns that no longer require reinforcement. Law replaces direct judgment. Custom replaces instruction. Expectation replaces encounter. People begin to behave not because gods are watching, but because outcomes are remembered. Memory is heavier than presence. Presence can be challenged. It can be bargained with. It can be ignored when inconvenient. Memory cannot. Memory shapes anticipation. It governs action long before consequences arrive. When divine authority moves into memory, it becomes harder to resist and impossible to negotiate. This is why the Anunnaki fade from daily narrative without fading from influence. Their names remain, their decisions persist, their domains continue to function. Fate unfolds, judgment is rendered. Death proceeds according to established rules. The underworld remains ordered. None of this requires visible intervention. The silence that follows this transition is not empty, it is saturated. It is filled with accumulated precedent. Every past judgment becomes a warning. Every catastrophe becomes instruction. The world remembers what happens when balance fails. That memory governs behavior more effectively than constant oversight ever could. This shift changes how humans understand responsibility. In earlier phases, responsibility was reactive. People performed rituals to restore favor, to avert immediate disaster. In the later phase, responsibility becomes preventative. Rituals are performed not because disaster is imminent, but because neglect will eventually produce one. The timing is uncertain. The consequence is not. Uncertainty strengthens discipline. A system that punishes instantly can be gamed. A system that delays consequence cannot. Delay forces caution rather than calculation. The Anunnaki's withdrawal into distance introduces this uncertainty deliberately. Their judgments arrive when patterns align, not when individual actions occur. This makes their authority absolute when it finally manifests. The gods, once participants in shared systems, become principles governing them. Their sustenance is no longer imagined as physical consumption. It is imagined as continued relevance. As long as order holds, the gods are sustained. As long as rituals are remembered, their authority persists. Food offerings become acts of alignment rather than maintenance. This transformation does not diminish the importance of ritual, it deepens it. Ritual now sustains humans more than gods. It keeps memory alive. It reinforces boundaries even when divine presence feels distant. The act of offering becomes a reminder of limits rather than a transaction. The Anunnaki accept this change because it preserves their role. As guardians of fate, they do not need intimacy. They need inevitability. Distance provides that. Their judgments become rarer but more decisive. When they appear, it is unmistakable. Floods, collapses, irreversible decrees. These events feel sudden only because the gods have been silent so long. Silence in this worldview is not inactivity, it is trust. The gods trust the system to operate. They trust humans to maintain it. Only when that trust fails do they intervene. This trust is earned through repetition, through daily maintenance, through adherence to structure. The Anunnaki's life within this system becomes increasingly abstract. They no longer dwell in places that can be visited. Their homes become conceptual rather than spatial. The underworld remains, but it is no longer imagined as a location one might approach. It becomes a function. Judgment occurs because judgment must occur, not because judges are present. This abstraction protects divine authority from erosion. Familiarity breeds negotiation. Distance preserves finality. The Anunnaki are no longer figures one might appeal to. They are outcomes one must accept. This acceptance shapes human psychology profoundly. People begin to internalize limits rather than respond to threats. Internalized order is the most stable form of governance. It does not require enforcement. It persists even when belief wavers. Even when rituals become rote, the expectation of consequence remains. The Anunnakis' authority outlives devotion because it has been encoded into structure. This encoding is visible in how later texts speak of divine action. Stories move into the past. Myths recount origins and catastrophes rather than ongoing interaction. The gods become foundational rather than active. Their actions explain why the world works as it does, not how it is currently being managed. The Anunnaki in particular move into this foundational space. Fate exists because they fixed it. Is final because they enforce it. Judgment occurs because they established the rules. These functions continue regardless of whether the gods are perceived as present. This perception shift also changes how fear operates. Early fear is immediate and reactive. Later fear is anticipatory. It is the fear of accumulated imbalance, of crossing thresholds whose existence is known but whose location is uncertain. This fear encourages restraint rather than obedience. It produces caution rather than compliance. Caution is sustainable. Obedience requires enforcement. The Anunnakis' withdrawal encourages caution. People maintain rituals not because gods are watching, but because they know what happens when they do not. This knowledge is inherited rather than experienced. Memory replaces encounter. Memory also allows divine authority to scale. As societies grow larger and more complex, constant divine presence would become overwhelming. Distance allows a single set of principles to govern vast populations without requiring localized intervention. The Anunnakis' abstraction suits this expansion perfectly. Their role shifts from local judges to universal arbiters. Fate applies everywhere. Judgment is impartial. Distance ensures fairness. A judge too close to daily life risks bias. A judge remembered rather than encountered remains neutral. This neutrality reinforces the severity associated with the Anunnaki. They are not compassionate figures. They are not approachable. Their judgments are not softened by familiarity. This severity is not cruelty. It is consistency. Consistency preserves order. The world under this regime becomes quieter but more rigid. There is less dialogue with the divine, more reliance on inherited structure. This rigidity is the price of stability. It allows complex societies to endure without constant intervention. The Anunnakis' life within this framework is paradoxical. They are less visible but more influential, less active but more decisive. Their withdrawal strengthens rather than weakens their authority. This withdrawal also protects them from human excess. As populations grow and noise increases, direct divine presence would be strained. Distance insulates the gods from overload. It preserves clarity. The Anunnakis' judgments remain unclouded because they are not immersed in daily disorder. Their lifestyle adapts accordingly. They no longer require daily offerings in proximity. They require consistency across time. They do not require acknowledgement at every moment. They require alignment across generations. Alignment is maintained through repetition. Through law, through ritual, through story, each reinforces memory. Memory reinforces expectation. Expectation governs behavior. At this stage, divine sustenance becomes almost indistinguishable from cosmic stability. The gods are sustained as long as the world continues to operate according to established patterns. Disorder threatens not because it offends gods, but because it undermines the structures that support existence itself. This understanding reframes divine punishment. Punishment is not retaliation, it is correction. It resets systems that have drifted too far. The Anunnaki do not intervene lightly because intervention is disruptive. They prefer the world to regulate itself. When regulation fails, correction is absolute. Floods erase accumulated imbalance. Silence returns. The system restarts. Afterward, the gods withdraw again, memory is refreshed, structure resumes. This cycle repeats across eras. Presence, withdrawal, memory, intervention, silence, endurance. The Anunnakis' life is woven into this cycle. They are not outside it, they are its anchors. As time progresses, their presence becomes increasingly symbolic. Names remain, functions persist, stories are told. But direct interaction fades. This fading is not loss, it is maturation. The world no longer needs constant divine attention because it has internalized divine order. Humans learn to live within limits without needing reminders. This learning is uneven and fragile, but it is sufficient. The Anunnakis' success lies in making themselves unnecessary most of the time. Their authority persists precisely because it does not depend on visibility, it depends on consequence. This is the final transformation of divine life, from participants to principles, from eaters to enforcers, from presence to memory. And yet, even in this abstraction, traces of earlier intimacy remain. Rituals still echo ancient meals, offerings still recall shared systems. Temples still stand as reminders of proximity that once existed. These remnants keep memory grounded. They prevent authority from dissolving entirely into abstraction. The Anunnaki do not disappear into pure concept. They remain figures, names, stories, but their stories no longer describe daily life. They describe origin, law, and finality. They explain why things cannot be undone. This permanence is what makes their authority enduring. It does not depend on belief alone. It depends on structure. Even when belief fades, structure remains. Even when rituals are forgotten, consequences persist. The gods no longer need to be remembered consciously. Their influence operates unconsciously. It shapes expectations, behaviors, and responses without requiring invocation. This is the quietest and most unsettling form of power. It does not announce itself. It does not seek attention. It waits. Waiting is the Anunnakis' final posture. They wait not because they are inactive, but because the world is functioning. They wait because intervention is unnecessary. They wait because action would destabilize what has been achieved. When they act, it is because waiting has failed, because memory has been ignored, because structure has eroded beyond repair. In those moments, their distance collapses briefly, decisively. Then they withdraw again. This rhythm defines the later stages of divine life. Presence becomes rare, silence becomes normal, authority becomes invisible. Invisible authority is the most enduring kind. It survives cultural change. It adapts to new forms. It persists even when its origins are forgotten. The Anunnakis' journey from daily participants to distant arbiters reflects the maturation of the world itself. As systems grow more complex, they require less direct oversight. As humans learn to maintain order, gods step back. This stepping back is not resignation, it is confidence. Confidence that structure will hold, confidence that memory will govern, confidence that consequence will teach what presence no longer must. The Anunnakis' life within this confidence is austere. There is no celebration, no intimacy, no relief, only vigilance and restraint, only readiness for the moment when restraint fails. They do not live above the world, they live beneath it, within its foundations. Their authority supports everything without being seen, and it is here in this quiet endurance that the Anunnaki become most difficult to imagine and most difficult to escape. Because a god who must be fed can be bargained with, a god who must be remembered cannot. By the time divine authority settles fully into memory, the world has learned something dangerous and something necessary at the same time. It has learned how to continue without reassurance. It has learned how to endure silence. It has learned how to operate under the weight of consequence rather than the comfort of presence. This is the world the Anunnaki leave behind, not empty, not abandoned, but disciplined. In earlier ages, the gods were felt as forces close enough to interrupt daily life. A failed ritual could be corrected, a neglected offering could be restored. Divine displeasure, when it appeared, could still be negotiated with renewed attention. But once authority becomes structural rather than immediate, negotiation loses its place. What remains is inevitability. The Anunnaki do not argue with inevitability. They are its guardians. This shift produces a subtle but profound change in how humans experience meaning. When gods are present, meaning is reinforced through interaction. When gods withdraw, meaning must be carried internally. Humans begin to orient themselves around expectation rather than instruction. They follow patterns not because they are told to, but because deviation carries unknown risk. Unknown risk is more effective than known punishment. Known punishment can be weighed, anticipated, even accepted. Unknown consequence encourages restraint at every level. It discourages excess. It favors moderation. It aligns behavior with continuity rather than desire. This is the environment in which the Anunnaki's influence reaches its fullest expression. Their judgments are no longer events, they are assumptions. People live as though judgment exists even when it is not seen. They accept limits even when no boundary is actively enforced. This internalization marks the final success of divine governance. At this stage, the Anunnaki are no longer experienced as beings who live somewhere else. They are experienced as conditions under which life unfolds. Death is final, fate is binding, actions accumulate weight. These realities do not require explanation, they simply are. The underworld, once imagined as a place ruled by judges, becomes an outcome rather than a destination. People no longer speak of entering a realm overseen by divine figures. They speak of what follows death as a fixed process. Judgment has become procedural. Fate has become automatic. The Anunnaki's role persists, but invisibly. This invisibility alters fear itself. Early fear was personal. It involved offending gods, failing rituals, provoking response. Later fear is impersonal. It involves crossing thresholds without knowing exactly where they lie. It involves breaking patterns whose importance is remembered but not fully understood. This form of fear does not paralyze, it disciplines, it encourages adherence to tradition. It favors repetition over experimentation. It reinforces inherited structure. In this way, memory becomes conservative. It preserves what has worked rather than inviting what might. The Anunnaki, as figures of judgment rather than creation, align perfectly with this conservatism. They are not innovators, they are preservers. Their authority exists to ensure that once something has been fixed, it remains fixed. Change is possible, but only within limits. Beyond those limits, correction replaces adaptation. Correction is not gentle, it is definitive. Because it is rare, it is overwhelming. When the system finally fails, when memory has been ignored too long, when maintenance collapses entirely, intervention arrives not as guidance but as reset, floods erase. Silence returns, structures are stripped down to what can endure. Afterward, the world resumes under renewed memory. People remember what happened, they rebuild cautiously, they repeat rituals with greater care. The gods withdraw again, the cycle continues. This cyclical pattern is not progress in the modern sense, it is endurance. The goal is not improvement, it is survival across time. The Anunnaki do not promise a better world, they enforce a stable one. Stability in this worldview is not comfort, it is restraint. It is the ability to persist without collapse. The Anunnaki's lives reflect this value completely. There is no joy described in their existence, no pleasure in their role, only obligation. Obligation without relief is difficult to imagine as power. But in the Sumerian imagination, this is precisely what defines authority. The one who cannot abandon responsibility holds the greatest power. The Anunnaki cannot step away. They can only step back. Stepping back preserves clarity. It prevents contamination. It allows perspective. Perspective allows finality. Finality is the essence of judgment. A judgment that can be revised endlessly is not a judgment. It is negotiation. The Anunnakis' distance ensures that when judgment arrives, it cannot be bargained with. There is no appeal to presence, only acceptance of outcome. This acceptance becomes woven into daily life. People learn to live with consequences rather than seek forgiveness. They focus on maintaining balance rather than correcting mistakes after they occur. This shift changes moral orientation. It replaces repentance with caution. It replaces confession with adherence. Adherence is quieter. It does not draw attention. It does not seek validation. It simply continues. The Anunnakis' authority thrives in this quietness. As centuries pass, stories of direct divine interaction feel increasingly distant. They belong to an earlier, less stable world. Later generations inherit those stories as explanations rather than experiences. Myths become foundations rather than conversations. The Anunnaki, once figures in narrative, become figures behind narrative. They are no longer characters. They are assumptions. Fate exists, death is final, judgment is unavoidable. These truths do not require storytellers, they require memory. Memory is maintained through ritual repetition, legal precedent, and social expectation. Even when belief weakens, these structures remain. People follow laws without invoking gods. They observe boundaries without recalling their origin. The Anunnakis' authority persists because it no longer depends on belief. Belief is fragile, structure is not. This is the final refinement of divine power. A God who must be believed in order to function is vulnerable. A God who functions regardless of belief is enduring. The Anunnaki become the latter. Their sustenance at this stage is not food, not ritual, not even remembrance in the conscious sense. It is consequence itself. As long as actions lead to outcomes, as long as imbalance produces correction, their role remains active. They do not need to be honored. They need to be inevitable. This inevitability reshapes how humans understand time. Time is no longer a series of moments awaiting divine input. It becomes a process unfolding according to fixed principles. Past actions shape future conditions. Fate accumulates rather than appears. This accumulation reinforces patience. People learn that consequences may not arrive immediately. They learn that delay does not equal forgiveness. This understanding discourages excess more effectively than threat ever could. The Anunnakis' patience is not mercy, it is strategy. By allowing imbalance to grow, they ensure that intervention, when it comes, addresses the system rather than the symptom. This makes correction efficient if devastating. Efficiency matters in a fragile world. Resources are limited. Attention is limited. Intervention must be decisive to avoid repetition. The Anunnaki do not waste judgment. Their restraint also protects them from entanglement. A God constantly involved in human affairs becomes compromised. Bias enters, emotion interferes, distance preserves impartiality. The Anunnakis' severity stems from this impartiality. Impartial judgment is rarely comforting. It does not account for intention, it responds to outcome. In this worldview, outcome matters more than motive. A collapsed system does not care why it collapsed, it must be corrected. This emphasis on outcome over intention shapes ethics deeply. Good intentions do not excuse imbalance. Proper ritual does not excuse neglect elsewhere. Everything must function together. Partial order is not enough. The Anunnaki embody this uncompromising standard. They do not reward effort, they respond to result. This makes their authority feel harsh, but it also makes it predictable. Predictability in the long term is a form of mercy. A predictable system allows preparation, it allows restraint, it allows survival. An unpredictable God invites panic. The Anunnaki avoid this by withdrawing into principle rather than personality. As a result, divine life becomes almost indistinguishable from cosmic law. The gods are no longer separate from how the world works, they are how the world works. This is why later generations struggle to imagine them as living beings. Their lives have become too abstract, too bound up with structure, too distant from emotion. But this abstraction is precisely what allows their influence to persist. Living like the Anunnaki in this final form means existing without affirmation. It means enforcing limits without gratitude. It means maintaining order without recognition. It is a lonely form of power. Loneliness, however, is irrelevant to function. The Anunnaki do not seek connection. They seek continuity. Connection invites complication. Continuity demands restraint. Their withdrawal into invisibility is not retreat. It is completion. They have succeeded in embedding order deeply enough that it no longer requires their presence. And yet this success carries a cost. A world governed by memory rather than presence can feel indifferent. Suffering occurs without explanation. Catastrophe arrives without warning. There is no voice to appeal to, no face to confront. The Sumerian texts do not deny this discomfort. They reflect it in lamentations, in grief, in acceptance rather than protest. Humans mourn losses without expecting reversal. They endure rather than demand. This endurance mirrors divine life itself. The Anunnaki endure without relief. Humans endure without reassurance. The symmetry is deliberate. In this way, divine withdrawal does not distance gods from humanity. It aligns them. Both exist under constraint. Both must accept consequence. Both live within systems that cannot be bent indefinitely. This shared constraint is the final bond between gods and humans. Not intimacy, not affection, but limitation. The Anunnaki are powerful because they cannot escape their role. Humans are bound because they cannot escape consequence. The world persists because neither side is free to abandon responsibility. This is not a comforting worldview. It offers no salvation, no redemption, no promise of improvement. It offers only continuity, only the possibility that structure will hold long enough for life to continue. As the night deepens, this understanding settles differently than spectacle ever could. It does not excite, it does not reassure, it steadies. The Anunnaki do not promise meaning. They enforce conditions under which meaning can exist. They do not grant purpose. They preserve the possibility of purpose enduring. They do not watch, they wait. And in that waiting, they continue to shape the world without ever appearing within it again. There is a quiet violence in a world that continues without explanation. Not the violence of catastrophe, but the violence of inevitability, a flood that comes without warning, a famine that unfolds without accusation, a death that arrives without appeal. In such a world, the absence of divine presence does not feel like freedom, it feels like exposure. And yet this exposure is precisely what allows order to endure beyond belief. The Anunnaki do not soften this condition. They are not figures who intervene to restore comfort. They are figures who ensure that once a threshold is crossed, the outcome cannot be undone. Their authority rests not in compassion but in finality. This finality is what gives structure its weight. Without it, rules become suggestions, rituals become habits, and memory loses its force. In earlier phases of divine life, proximity allowed for correction. A ritual could be repeated, an offering could be restored, a god might be appeased. In the later phase, these mechanisms lose effectiveness. Correction gives way to consequence. The system no longer responds to gestures, it responds to accumulated imbalance. This shift changes how humans experience error. Mistakes are no longer events that can be fixed through immediate action. They become contributions to a larger pattern. Each failure adds weight. Each neglect deepens drift. People begin to understand that the cost of disorder is delayed, not erased. Delayed cost is more demanding than immediate punishment. It requires foresight. It demands restraint in the absence of threat. It forces individuals and communities to imagine outcomes beyond the present moment. This is a heavy burden, but it is one the world must carry once divine presence recedes. The Anunnakis' withdrawal makes this burden unavoidable. Without visible judges, humans must judge themselves against inherited structure. They must maintain systems without knowing exactly when failure will become catastrophic. This uncertainty sharpens attention. It discourages excess. It favors repetition over innovation. Innovation in this worldview is dangerous, not because change is forbidden, but because change introduces unpredictability. Unpredictability threatens balance. Balance is fragile. Once lost, it cannot always be restored gently. The Anunnaki are not enemies of change. They are enemies of instability. Change that preserves structure is tolerated. Change that erodes it invites correction. This distinction is subtle and often misunderstood. It is not novelty that provokes judgment, but accumulation of strain. Strain appears in the texts as noise, crowding, ritual neglect, impurity, overgrowth. These are not moral failings. They are systemic pressures. They indicate that the world is operating beyond its capacity. Capacity matters more than intention. When capacity is exceeded, collapse becomes inevitable. The Anunnaki do not cause collapse out of anger. They allow it to occur because preventing it would require constant intervention. Constant intervention would undermine the very structure they exist to preserve. This logic reveals something essential about divine restraint. The gods could intervene constantly. They choose not to. This choice is not mercy. It is discipline. A system protected from all failure never learns to regulate itself. It becomes dependent. Dependency weakens order. By withdrawing, the Anunnaki force the world to internalize regulation. Humans must learn to anticipate limits. They must learn to recognize early signs of imbalance. They must act before catastrophe, not after. This expectation reshapes social behavior. Communities become conservative not out of fear of gods, but out of respect for precedent. What has worked before is trusted. What has failed before is avoided. Memory becomes a guide more powerful than instruction. The gods no longer need to speak because memory speaks for them. Each past disaster becomes a lesson. Each recovery becomes a warning. The Anunnaki's authority is carried forward through these remembered outcomes. In this sense, divine life becomes inseparable from history. The gods no longer act in the present, they act through the past. Their decisions echo forward, shaping conditions long after their presence has withdrawn. This historical authority is difficult to challenge because it is not localized. There is no shrine to confront, no oracle to question. The gods are everywhere and nowhere, embedded in cause and effect. This embedding changes how humans experience guilt and responsibility. Guilt no longer centers on offending a deity. It centers on contributing to imbalance. Responsibility is collective rather than individual. One person's neglect may not cause collapse, but many small neglects will. The Anunnaki preside over this collective responsibility without direct engagement. They do not punish individuals for isolated acts. They correct systems that have failed collectively. This scale of judgment reinforces the importance of shared maintenance. Ritual in this context becomes communal memory rather than personal devotion. It reminds communities of shared limits. It reinforces boundaries that protect everyone. Even when belief weakens, ritual persists because it organizes behavior. Law functions similarly. Laws are not expressions of divine will so much as crystallizations of past judgment. They encode what has been learned about capacity and consequence. Obeying law is less about obedience and more about survival. The Anunnaki's influence is strongest where law and ritual converge. Both exist to preserve structure, both discourage excess, both rely on repetition rather than innovation. This convergence creates a world that values continuity above all else. Progress is measured not by advancement but by endurance. A city that survives generations without collapse is successful. A society that maintains balance is virtuous. Virtue in this worldview is not moral purity, it is restraint. It is the ability to live within limits without constant correction. The Anunnaki embody this virtue completely. Their lives are defined by what they do not do. They do not indulge, they do not explain, they do not comfort, they do not rescue at the last moment. Their power lies in refusal to intervene prematurely, refusal to soften consequence, refusal to negotiate finality. This refusal is what allows the world to develop resilience. A system cushioned from consequence becomes fragile. A system exposed to consequence becomes cautious. Caution preserves balance. Balance, however, is not static. It requires constant adjustment. This adjustment is performed by humans through daily labor, ritual, and restraint. The gods do not adjust the system themselves. They judge when adjustment has failed. This division of labor is essential. Humans manage process. Gods manage thresholds. Process can be flexible. Thresholds cannot. Once crossed, they demand response. The Anunnaki's lives revolve around these thresholds. They are not concerned with everyday activity. They are concerned with points of no return. Their vigilance is oriented toward detecting when gradual drift has become irreversible failure. Detecting this moment requires patience, it requires distance, it requires silence. The Anunnaki's withdrawal is therefore not absence but focus. They attend to patterns rather than events. Patterns reveal themselves only over time. Immediate reaction obscures them. By waiting, the gods allow patterns to emerge clearly. When judgment arrives, it addresses the root rather than the symptom. This pattern-based governance is efficient but unforgiving. It does not spare those caught in collapse. It does not differentiate between degrees of guilt. It resets systems wholesale. From a human perspective, this feels unjust. Innocent people suffer alongside the guilty. Cities are destroyed regardless of individual behavior. The texts do not deny this. They acknowledge it without apology. In the Sumerian imagination, justice is not about fairness to individuals. It is about restoring balance to systems. Individual suffering is tragic but secondary. Without system correction, suffering would become universal. The Anunnaki enforce this harsh logic without hesitation. Their role is not to minimize pain, it is to prevent total collapse. This makes them frightening but also necessary. Necessity defines divine life more than desire. The gods do not choose their role, they occupy it. They are bound by it. Their authority is not freedom, it is obligation. This obligation isolates them. There is no companionship described among the Anunnaki. No shared joy, no relief from responsibility. Even divine councils are portrayed as tense, burdened, reluctant. These portrayals reveal a conception of power that is heavy rather than triumphant. Power carries cost. It demands restraint. It requires sacrifice of closeness, comfort, and spontaneity. The Anunnaki sacrifice presence to preserve order. They sacrifice intimacy to maintain clarity. They sacrifice explanation to ensure finality. This sacrifice is mirrored imperfectly in human life. Leaders must withdraw to govern. Judges must remain distant to remain impartial. Parents must allow consequences to teach. These echoes suggest that divine life is not entirely alien. It is exaggerated responsibility. Exaggerated responsibility produces solitude. The Anunnaki exist alone within their function. Their withdrawal is not just spatial, it is relational. They do not engage emotionally. Emotion introduces bias. Bias undermines judgment. Judgment must be impersonal to be authoritative. The Anunnaki's impersonality is therefore not coldness. It is discipline. This discipline extends to how they are remembered. Later traditions do not emphasize their personalities. They emphasize their roles. Names persist, but character fades. Function endures. This fading of character is deliberate. A god remembered for personality invites interpretation. A god remembered for function enforces expectation. The Anunnaki become known not for who they are, but for what happens when balance fails. This reputation is more powerful than any myth. It does not require belief. It requires recognition of consequence. As time passes, even the memory of the Anunnaki as figures may fade, but the logic they enforced remains. Systems still collapse when overloaded. Silence still follows catastrophe. Rebuilding still requires restraint. In this way, the Anunnaki do not disappear. They dissolve into the structure of reality itself. Their authority becomes indistinguishable from how the world works. This dissolution is the final form of divine life. It is not transcendence, it is integration. To live like the Anunnaki in this sense is not to command or to create. It is to wait, to observe, and to act only when restraint can no longer preserve balance. It is to accept that intervention is failure, not success. It is to carry responsibility without reward. To enforce limits without gratitude. To remain silent while others suffer, knowing that speaking would worsen collapse. This is not a life of glory, it is a life of endurance. And yet, endurance is the only thing that allows anything else to exist at all. The Anunnaki do not promise meaning. They preserve the conditions under which meaning might survive. They do not offer hope. They offer continuity. They do not watch. They wait. And the world, shaped by that waiting, continues, fragile, constrained, and still standing. When endurance becomes the highest virtue, time itself changes character. It no longer feels like a river rushing forward toward improvement or revelation. It becomes weight, layer upon layer of accumulated decision, habit, neglect, and restraint pressing down on the present moment. This is the temporal world shaped by the Anunnaki's withdrawal, a world where nothing is ever entirely new because everything carries the residue of what came before. In such a world, the future is not imagined as open possibility. It is imagined as consequence waiting to surface. This does not produce despair, it produces caution. People learn to move carefully, to repeat what has proven survivable, to mistrust sudden change. Stability becomes sacred not because it is pleasant, but because it is rare. The Anunnaki preside over this condition without intervention. Their silence teaches more effectively than speech ever could. Each generation inherits not commandments but outcomes. Cities remember floods, families remember famine, laws remember collapse. Memory becomes the primary medium of instruction. This memory is not sentimental. It does not soften over time. It hardens. It becomes institutional. Written law replaces spoken warning. Architecture replaces ritual presence. Boundaries are built into streets, walls, canals, and calendars. The gods are no longer needed to enforce these boundaries directly. Their judgments have already been encoded. This encoding explains why divine life fades from narrative without fading from structure. The Anunnaki do not vanish suddenly. They become unnecessary to mention. When systems function, their guardians do not need to appear. Only when systems fail does their absence become noticeable. Noticeability then becomes the signal. When the gods are felt, something is already wrong. Divine presence is not a sign of blessing. It is a sign of failure. The appearance of judgment means restraint has already broken down. This inversion is critical. In later religious frameworks, divine presence often signals salvation. In the Sumerian imagination, it signals emergency. The Anunnaki appear when correction can no longer be delayed. Their arrival is not comforting, it is final. This understanding changes how prayer functions. Prayer is no longer a request for intervention, it is an expression of alignment. It is not meant to summon gods, but to remind humans of limits. Prayer disciplines the one who prays, it does not obligate the one addressed. Ritual functions the same way. It does not feed divine hunger, it feeds human memory. Each repeated act reinforces awareness of structure. Each offering recalls the cost of neglect. Ritual becomes a form of education rather than exchange. Education without explanation is severe. It teaches through repetition rather than reasoning. People do not always know why a ritual exists. They know only that abandoning it has consequences. This ignorance does not weaken the system, it strengthens it. Understanding invites debate. Habit preserves continuity. The Anunnaki benefit from this opacity. Their authority is not subject to interpretation. It is subject to outcome. Outcomes do not argue, they arrive. As generations pass, the original logic behind rituals and laws may fade, but their function remains. People obey without invoking gods. They maintain order without expecting reward. The system continues. This continuation gives the impression that the gods are gone, but in truth they are everywhere. They are present in every constraint that cannot be ignored. Every boundary that resists desire, every consequence that arrives without warning. The Anunnaki's power is now indistinguishable from inevitability. This makes them impossible to appease and impossible to escape. Appeasement requires presence, escape requires absence. They offer neither. This form of power is deeply unsettling because it offers no dialogue. There is no negotiation with memory, no bargain with structure, no plea that can undo accumulation. And yet this is the only form of power that can persist across centuries without corruption. A god who listens too often becomes inconsistent. A god who explains invites loopholes. A god who forgives repeatedly undermines consequence. The Anunnaki avoid these failures by refusing proximity. Their withdrawal is not neglect. It is discipline imposed upon themselves as much as upon the world. Divine discipline mirrors human discipline at a greater scale. Just as individuals must restrain impulse to survive, gods must restrain intervention to preserve order. Excess action destroys balance as surely as neglect. This symmetry reveals a deeply sobering worldview. Power, whether human or divine, is dangerous when exercised freely. Freedom is not the highest good, continuity is. The Anunnaki choose continuity over expression, endurance over involvement, silence over presence. Their lives are not lived outward. They are lived inward within the narrow confines of function. Function replaces identity. The gods are no longer known for who they are, but for what they do when everything else fails. They are remembered at the edge, not at the center. Edges define systems, birth and death, creation and collapse, beginning and end. The Anunnaki dwell at these edges, intervening only when transitions become unstable. This edge-dwelling existence is lonely by design. There is no companionship at the boundary, only vigilance. Only readiness. Readiness is sustained through restraint. The gods do not dissipate their attention through constant engagement. They conserve it. They wait. Waiting is not emptiness. It is tension held in reserve, a drawn bow that has not yet released its arrow. This tension gives divine action its weight. When the arrow is released, it cannot be recalled. This irreversibility is what gives fate its meaning. Fate is not prediction, it is commitment. Once fixed, it must unfold. Reversal would collapse trust in structure. The Anunnaki are bound by this rule more strictly than anyone. Once judgment is passed, they cannot undo it without undermining their own authority. This constraint makes their role unbearable and absolute at the same time. They do not delight in judgment. The texts never portray satisfaction. They portray necessity. Action occurs because inaction has become impossible. This necessity strips divine life of choice. Choice implies alternatives. The Anunnaki operate where alternatives have been exhausted. They act when the system has narrowed to a single remaining outcome. This is why their interventions feel catastrophic. Catastrophe is what remains when gradual correction has failed. Floods, plagues, and collapse are not divine moods. They are systemic endpoints. The Anunnaki enforce them because someone must. Afterward, they withdraw again, not out of triumph, but out of exhaustion. The system has been reset. Memory has been refreshed. Their presence is no longer required. This cycle continues not because it is ideal, but because it is the only one that works in a fragile world. Fragility is assumed. The Sumerian worldview does not imagine a perfect creation corrupted by sin. It imagines an imperfect world held together through constant maintenance and occasional rupture. The Anunnaki exist to manage rupture. Humans exist to manage maintenance. When maintenance succeeds, rupture is delayed. When it fails, rupture occurs. This division of responsibility is clear and unforgiving. There is no overlap. Humans cannot prevent ultimate collapse. Gods cannot perform daily labor. Each role has limits. Limits define existence at every level. To live like the Anunnaki is to live entirely within limit, to never escape obligation, to never indulge, to never forget consequence. This is not a life humans are meant to envy. It is a life meant to terrify into restraint. And yet there is something strangely stable about it. A world governed by limits rather than desire does not spiral endlessly. It breaks, but it breaks predictably. It rebuilds, but it rebuilds cautiously. The Anunnaki's absence allows this predictability. Their presence would destabilize it. Over time, as cultures shift and languages change, the names of the Anunnaki may fade, but their logic does not. It persists in every system that values restraint over growth, continuity over innovation, memory over novelty. Even when myths are forgotten, the structure remains. Even when gods are denied, consequence persists. This is the final irony of divine withdrawal. The gods become most powerful when they are least believed in. Belief invites expectation. Expectation invites disappointment. Disappointment erodes authority. Structure does not disappoint, it simply operates. The Anunnaki become structure. They do not speak, they do not appear, they do not explain, they wait. And the world, heavy with memory and bound by consequence, continues to turn beneath that waiting. When waiting becomes the defining condition of power, presence transforms into something almost geological. It is no longer an event. It is a pressure that shapes behavior over generations. The Anunnaki no longer act within time so much as they compress it. Every uncorrected choice adds weight. Every repeated neglect thickens the layer. Eventually, the ground gives way, not suddenly, but inevitably. This inevitability is the true inheritance they leave behind. The world that forms beneath their silence is not one of freedom, but of calibration. Every action is measured not against desire, but against survivability. People no longer ask whether something is right, they ask whether it has endured before. Novelty becomes dangerous. Innovation becomes suspect. What has lasted acquires moral weight simply by persisting. This is not stagnation, it is defensive living. In such a world, wisdom is not brilliance, it is memory that has not been erased. Elders are valued not for insight, but for having lived long enough to remember consequences others have forgotten. Stories become warnings rather than inspiration. Myths do not uplift, they caution. The Anunnaki do not need to speak into this environment. Their work has already been done. The patterns they enforced have hardened into instinct. People feel unease without knowing why. They sense danger without seeing it. This unease is the residue of divine judgment embedded into culture. Fear in this system is not terror, it is attentiveness. Attentiveness keeps excess in check, it prevents escalation, it slows momentum. The gods do not need to intervene because fear has learned to regulate itself. This is why divine silence stretches so long. Silence is no longer neglect. It is confirmation that the system is functioning. The Anunnaki remain at the outer edge of relevance. They are not forgotten, but they are no longer invoked daily. Their names appear in legal formulas, funerary language, boundary oaths. They are remembered where finality matters. Death, especially, preserves their relevance. Death is the one threshold humans cannot negotiate, reinterpret, or escape. It is where memory condenses into certainty. No matter how distant the gods feel in life, they remain present at death, not as comforters but as arbiters. The underworld remains ordered because death must be ordered. Without order, death would contaminate life. Grief would become chaos. Meaning would dissolve. The Anunnaki preside over this containment quietly. They ensure that death does not spill backward into the living world. They keep the boundary firm. Boundaries are their true domain. Every boundary maintained reduces the need for action. Every boundary crossed increases it. This is why they wait rather than patrol. Patrol implies constant correction. Waiting allows violations to reveal themselves as patterns. Patterns justify judgment. The gods do not act on impulse because impulse is noise. Noise obscures pattern. The Anunnaki require clarity, and clarity only emerges over time. Time, therefore, is their instrument. They stretch it, compress it, allow it to accumulate. Human impatience does not concern them. Urgency is a human weakness. Systems collapse faster when urgency governs behavior. The gods do not rush because rushing destabilizes outcomes. This patience, when misread, appears cruel. Why allow suffering to persist? Why not intervene earlier? Why wait until collapse? The answer is structural rather than moral. Early intervention teaches dependence. Dependence erodes resilience. Resilience is the only thing that allows systems to persist without constant divine involvement. The Anunnaki do not preserve comfort, they preserve continuity. Comfort produces complacency. Complacency invites neglect. Neglect accumulates invisibly until collapse becomes unavoidable. Suffering, by contrast, teaches attention. It sharpens memory. It reinforces boundaries. It keeps systems alert. This does not make suffering virtuous. It makes it functional. The gods do not desire suffering. They tolerate it because eliminating it would dissolve the system they are tasked to preserve. This is the most difficult truth embedded in their worldview. Divine goodness is not measured by relief, but by endurance. A world that survives harshly is preferable to one that collapses gently. This preference is reflected everywhere. Cities are built defensively. Laws prioritize stability over fairness. Social roles are rigid. Mobility is limited. Change is incremental. The Anunnaki's influence is visible not in temples, but in constraints. Constraints protect the system from itself. Human ambition left unchecked accelerates imbalance. Growth strains resources, expansion increases noise, complexity multiplies failure points. The gods do not oppose ambition because it is immoral. They oppose it because it is destabilizing. Every myth that depicts divine punishment of human excess is not condemning desire, it is correcting scale. Scale is the true danger. Small systems can tolerate error. Large systems magnify it. The Anunnaki intervene when systems grow beyond their capacity to self-regulate. This is why population growth appears repeatedly as a problem. It is not the number of humans that matters, it is the pressure they generate. Pressure overwhelms boundaries. Boundaries fail, collapse follows. The gods respond by reducing scale. This reduction is never framed as mercy. It is framed as necessity. Mercy would imply alternative outcomes. Necessity implies there are none. The Anunnaki act when the system has narrowed to a single remaining correction. This narrowing is invisible to those living within it. People experience only hardship, confusion, loss. They do not see the accumulated imbalance that made catastrophe unavoidable. This invisibility preserves divine authority. If humans understood precisely when judgment would fall, they would manipulate the system. Uncertainty enforces restraint. The gods maintain uncertainty deliberately, not by hiding information, but by allowing time to blur causation. Consequences arrive long after decisions. This delay prevents simplistic moral accounting. No one can say, this happened because of that single act. Instead, people must confront pattern rather than blame. Pattern cannot be argued away. The Anunnaki are guardians of pattern, not morality. Morality changes with culture. Pattern does not. This distinction allows their authority to persist across eras. Even when ethical frameworks shift, consequences remain. Systems still collapse when strained beyond capacity. Resources still fail when overused. Noise still disrupts order. The gods do not need to adapt because they do not govern values. They govern thresholds. Thresholds are universal. Every system has limits. Exceed them and correction follows. The Anunnaki embody this logic so completely that their presence becomes unnecessary most of the time. The world polices itself through consequence. This self-policing is the ultimate success of divine withdrawal. The gods no longer need to enforce restraint because restraint has been internalized. People feel unease before excess. They hesitate before expansion. They repeat what has worked. Even rebellion follows patterns. Revolutions do not seek freedom. They seek restoration. They invoke memory rather than novelty. The past becomes the benchmark. This backward orientation is not nostalgia, it is survival. The future is feared because it has not yet proven survivable. This fear stabilizes society at the cost of possibility. The gods accept this cost. Possibility threatens continuity. The Anunnaki choose continuity every time. This choice defines their existence. It strips away glamour, creativity, and intimacy. What remains is function. Function is relentless. It does not rest, it does not forgive, it does not explain. To live as a function is to exist without relief. This is the burden of divine authority. Humans may suffer more acutely, but gods suffer more persistently. They cannot escape responsibility. They cannot abdicate. They cannot forget. Memory weighs heavier on immortals than mortals. Mortals forget. Gods remember everything. This memory is not emotional. It is structural. They remember what happens when systems fail. They remember collapse across epochs. This memory makes restraint unavoidable. The Anunnaki do not dream of alternatives. They enforce what has proven survivable. This enforcement becomes increasingly abstract as cultures evolve. Laws replace rituals, economics replace offerings, infrastructure replaces myth, but the logic remains. Maintenance delays collapse, neglect accelerates it. The gods retreat further, not because they are no longer needed, but because their work has been embedded. Embedded power is the most dangerous kind because it is invisible. People argue with visible authority. They resist it. They overthrow it. Invisible authority governs without resistance because it appears as reality itself. The Anunnaki achieve this invisibility through withdrawal. They do not demand worship. They do not require belief. They operate regardless. When belief fades, consequence does not. This is why divine authority outlasts religion. Long after temples crumble and names are forgotten, systems still punish excess. Resources still fail. Noise still destabilizes. People call these outcomes natural rather than divine. The Anunnaki do not object. Names were never important. Function was. To live like them is to accept that power is not expression but constraint, not creativity but repetition, not presence but endurance. This life is not enviable, it is austere. It is a life without joy, without novelty, without intimacy, but it is a life that persists. Persistence is the only victory that matters in a fragile world. The Anunnaki accept loneliness, distance, and silence because these preserve order. They give up being known so that systems can survive. In doing so, they become indistinguishable from inevitability. Inevitability does not speak, it arrives, and when it arrives, no explanation is required. When inevitability becomes the dominant experience of existence, even resistance begins to change shape. It no longer takes the form of rebellion or defiance. It becomes delay. It becomes denial. It becomes the quiet hope that consequence might arrive later or not at all. The Anunnaki understand this impulse intimately. It is the final human defense against structure, and it is why time remains their greatest ally. Time dissolves excuses. It erodes justification. It reveals whether a system can endure its own contradictions. No argument survives long enough to outweigh accumulated outcome. No belief can shield a structure from what it produces. This is why the gods do not intervene to correct misunderstandings. Misunderstanding is irrelevant. Only effect matters. People may believe they are free. They may believe the gods are gone. They may believe the old stories no longer apply. The Anunnaki do not correct these beliefs. They allow them to play out. Belief does not alter thresholds. A society can reinterpret its myths endlessly, but it cannot reinterpret scarcity. It cannot reinterpret exhaustion. It cannot reinterpret collapse. These realities enforce themselves. This enforcement feels impersonal because it is. The Anunnaki do not act out of anger, preference, or identity. They act because systems reach limits. The moment a limit is crossed, response becomes unavoidable. That response may not be immediate, but it is certain. Certainty without immediacy is the most difficult form of authority to live under. It produces anxiety without release. There is no confrontation, no climax, no catharsis, only waiting. Waiting changes people. Under prolonged uncertainty, societies grow rigid. They cling to routine. They elevate precedent into law. They punish deviation not because it is immoral, but because it is risky. Risk is the enemy of endurance. The Anunnaki preside over this risk calculus silently. They do not prohibit change. They allow systems to punish it. This distinction matters. Prohibition invites rebellion. Consequence invites caution. Caution slows momentum. Slowed momentum allows correction before collapse. This is why divine justice appears slow. Speed favors destruction. The gods are not slow because they are indifferent. They are slow because they are precise. Precision requires patience. Impatience is human. It seeks resolution, explanation, reassurance. The gods offer none. In their absence, humans fill the silence with interpretation. They invent motives, they assign personalities, they tell stories. Stories soften inevitability. They give it a face, they make it negotiable, but the outcomes remain unchanged. This tension between narrative and structure defines the later stages of divine withdrawal. Gods become characters in stories while their function operates elsewhere. People argue about myths while living under consequences they no longer recognize as divine. This misrecognition does not weaken authority, it strengthens it. Authority that does not need recognition is absolute. The Anunnaki no longer require fear. Fear exhausts itself. What they require is compliance with limits. Limits do not ask permission, they assert themselves through failure. A canal silts, a crop fails, a city overheats with noise and conflict, a population exceeds its resources. No god needs to appear for these things to happen. The Anunnaki watch not as spectators but as custodians. Their task is not to prevent every failure, but to ensure that failure does not cascade into total erasure. They allow systems to break but not to vanish. This is another misunderstood aspect of their role. Collapse is not annihilation. It is pruning. Pruning is painful, but it preserves the organism. Total annihilation would erase memory. Memory is essential. The gods protect memory even as they enforce consequence. After collapse, survivors remember. They rebuild differently. They restrain excess longer. This memory delays the next collapse. The cycle continues. From a human perspective, this feels cruel. Why allow repeated suffering? Why not end the cycle? Because ending the cycle would require freezing the world. A frozen system does not live, it stagnates. It accumulates fragility invisibly until it shatters completely. The Anunnaki prefer visible cycles to hidden decay. Visible suffering teaches. Hidden fragility deceives. This preference shapes their silence. They do not hide consequences. They allow them to be felt, but they also do not explain them. Explanation invites reinterpretation. Reinterpretation invites repetition. Silence forces confrontation with outcome rather than story. This is why divine communication fades. Speech becomes counterproductive. A speaking God invites debate. A silent structure invites adaptation. Adaptation is the goal, not moral improvement. Not enlightenment, survival. The Anunnaki do not guide humanity toward progress. Progress accelerates imbalance. They guide humanity toward persistence. Persistence looks like stagnation from within the system, but from outside it is stability. Stability is rare. It requires sacrifice. Sacrifice in this context is not ritual killing. It is the sacrifice of possibility, the sacrifice of expansion, the sacrifice of comfort. The gods demand these sacrifices indirectly. They make alternatives unsustainable. People comply because resistance fails. This compliance is not obedience. It is alignment with reality, reality shaped by the Anunnaki's long withdrawal. They do not impose reality, they allow it to emerge. Emergence is slower than decree but far more durable. Over centuries, this produces cultures obsessed with order. Hierarchies become rigid, roles become fixed, innovation becomes dangerous. These cultures are often judged harshly by later perspectives. They appear oppressive, stagnant, joyless. What is missed is context. These societies exist under constant awareness of fragility. They have learned through collapse that freedom without limit destroys itself. Their caution is not cowardice. It is memory, memory encoded into behavior. The Anunnaki are present in this memory even when unnamed. They are present in every hesitation before excess, every law that restricts growth, every ritual that repeats rather than invents. This presence is diffuse. It cannot be challenged directly. There is no temple to overthrow, no idol to smash, no priesthood to dismantle. The authority resides in consequence. Even rebellion must work within limits. Rebels overthrow rulers, not structures. Structures persist. This persistence frustrates those who seek change. Why does the new order resemble the old? Why does freedom narrow so quickly? Because the same limits still apply. The Anunnaki do not favor kings or rebels. They favor survivable configurations. Configurations that violate thresholds collapse regardless of ideology. This impartiality is their most terrifying trait. They do not reward virtue. They do not punish vice. They respond to imbalance. A just society can collapse if it exceeds capacity. An unjust society can persist if it maintains equilibrium. This truth undermines moral narratives. It replaces them with structural ones. People resist this replacement. They want meaning that flatters intention. The gods offer meaning that flatters endurance. Endurance does not care why something is done, only whether it can continue. This is the core of divine judgment in the Sumerian worldview. It is not about sin, it is about sustainability. The Anunnaki judge sustainability. Their judgments are not revelations, they are outcomes. Floods reveal poor water management. Famine reveals unsustainable agriculture. Plague reveals overcrowding. These events are not arbitrary punishments, they are feedback. Feedback ignored long enough becomes catastrophe. The gods do not escalate punishment, the system escalates consequence. This distinction absolves the gods of cruelty. It does not absolve the world of pain. Pain is the cost of learning limits. The Anunnaki do not eliminate pain because pain teaches faster than instruction. Instruction can be ignored. Pain cannot. This does not mean the gods delight in pain. Delight is irrelevant. Relevance is measured by effect. Pain alters behavior. Pleasure does not. This harsh calculus defines divine life. The gods are not compassionate in the human sense. Compassion prioritizes relief. Relief invites repetition. They are caretakers of a system that cannot afford repetition of failure. This caretaking isolates them. There is no gratitude for restraint, only resentment. People thank gods for blessing, not for withholding destruction. The Anunnaki receive no praise for disasters that do not happen. Their success is invisible. This invisibility deepens their withdrawal. Why remain present in a world that only notices you when everything has already gone wrong? The gods recede because their presence is misinterpreted. Humans anthropomorphize them, assign motives, create expectations. These distort their function. Withdrawal preserves clarity. As time passes, even scholars misread the old texts. They search for personality, narrative, intention. What they miss is system. The Anunnaki are not characters in a story. They are mechanisms. Mechanisms do not explain themselves. They operate. To live under a mechanism is unsettling because it offers no appeal. There is no mercy to request, no bargain to strike, only adjustment. Adjustment requires humility. Humility is learned through failure. The Anunnaki allow failure until humility becomes unavoidable. Then they withdraw again. This pattern repeats across ages. Civilizations rise confident in their mastery. They expand, they innovate, they grow noisy. Limits are crossed, correction follows, survivors rebuild cautiously. Memory fades, the cycle resumes. The gods remain unchanged throughout. They do not grow wiser, they do not learn, they do not adapt. They enforce what has always been true. This constancy makes them feel ancient even within ancient texts. They are older than myth because they are older than narrative. They exist wherever systems exist. Even now, long after their names have faded, their logic governs. Resources remain finite, noise still destabilizes, excess still collapses. People call these forces natural, economic, ecological. The Anunnaki do not object, names are irrelevant, function persists. To live like them is to accept that control is exercised best through absence. That authority endures through silence. That power survives by refusing to be visible. This is not a life humans should desire. It is a life humans should fear enough to restrain themselves. That fear is the final gift of divine withdrawal, not terror but awareness. Awareness that systems remember even when gods are forgotten. Awareness that consequence waits longer than patience. Awareness that silence is not emptiness but pressure accumulating. The Anunnaki do not need to return. They never left. Silence, when it persists long enough, ceases to feel empty. It becomes inhabited. Not by voices or figures, but by expectation. The expectation that something unseen is still accounting for what unfolds. The Anunnaki occupy this expectation, not as observers watching each act, but as the horizon against which all acts eventually collide. This is the final refinement of their presence. They do not hover, they do not loom, they define the limits of motion itself. In a world shaped by such limits, even hope changes form. Hope is no longer placed in rescue or intervention. It is placed in delay, in endurance, in the belief that collapse can be postponed long enough for one more generation to live without seeing it arrive. This is not optimism, it is calculation. People learn to hope quietly. Quiet hope does not challenge structure, it works within it. It does not imagine a different world. It imagines survival within this one. The Anunnaki do not extinguish hope, they constrain it. Unconstrained hope fuels expansion. Expansion strains systems. Strain invites collapse. Hope that remains small can coexist with endurance. This shaping of emotion is one of the least visible but most pervasive effects of divine withdrawal. Humans internalize restraint not only in action but in desire. They learn not to want too much, not to dream too loudly, not to expect permanence. Expectation becomes dangerous. Expectation creates disappointment. Disappointment fuels revolt. Revolt accelerates imbalance. The gods do not suppress revolt directly. They allow it to burn itself out against limits. Revolutions fail not because they are crushed, but because they replicate the structures they overthrow. The same constraints reassert themselves. This repetition teaches resignation, but also realism. Realism is the emotional counterpart to endurance. The Anunnaki do not reward realism, they rely on it. A population that understands limits governs itself more effectively than one that must be constantly corrected. Self-governance reduces the need for divine action. This reduction is the measure of success. The gods do not seek relevance. Relevance invites dependence. Dependence weakens systems. Irrelevance is strength. When gods become irrelevant to daily life, systems have matured. They no longer require constant reinforcement. They operate on internalized constraint. The Anunnaki withdraw most completely when this stage is reached. At this point, divine life becomes almost entirely abstract. They exist only at the far edges of thought, in death rituals, in oaths sworn at boundaries, in curses uttered when all other recourse has failed. Their names surface when finality is acknowledged. Finality is their language. They are invoked not to change outcomes, but to witness them. Witnessing is the last function of authority once intervention is no longer required. A witness does not act, a witness confirms. Confirmation is powerful. It transforms private failure into collective memory. It marks an outcome as irreversible. The Anunnaki witness the collapse of systems not to prevent them, but to ensure they are remembered accurately. Memory distorted is failure repeated. Memory preserved delays repetition. This is why myths linger long after belief fades. They are not preserved because they are believed. They are preserved because they encode outcomes. Flood stories endure because floods happen. Collapse narratives endure because collapse repeats. The gods embedded these narratives not as warnings but as records. Records do not persuade, they persist. Persistence is the only defense against forgetfulness. Forgetfulness is the most dangerous force in the Sumerian worldview. It erases the cost of past excess. It invites repetition without awareness. The Anunnaki combat forgetfulness by refusing to comfort. Comfort dulls memory. Pain sharpens it. This does not mean suffering is sacred. It means it is effective. Effectiveness overrides sentiment. The gods do not prioritize human flourishing. They prioritize systemic survival. Flourishing without constraint threatens survival. This is why golden ages are brief in myth. They are unstable. They invite overreach. Dark ages endure longer. They are cautious. They restrain desire. The Anunnaki do not favor darkness. They favor balance. Balance is not joyless, but it is unremarkable. It does not inspire epic stories. It does not produce heroes. It produces continuity. Continuity lacks drama. This lack of drama contributes to the illusion that gods are absent. People mistake the absence of spectacle for absence of control, but control is most complete when unnoticed. This is the final irony of divine authority in this worldview. The more effective it becomes, the less visible it is. A god who must appear to assert authority has already failed. The Anunnaki succeed by disappearing. Their disappearance is not abandonment, it is completion. Their work is finished not when humans are perfected, but when systems can fail without erasing memory. Failure without erasure allows learning. Learning allows adaptation. Adaptation allows survival. This chain replaces salvation as the ultimate goal. There is no final redemption in this worldview. There is no end state where collapse is impossible. There is only ongoing management of fragility. Fragility is assumed. Strength lies in acknowledging it. The Anunnaki embody this acknowledgement. They do not pretend the world can be made perfect. They accept that it cannot. Their authority lies in enforcing this acceptance. Human resistance to this truth fuels suffering more than the truth itself. People want guarantees. They want permanence. They want assurance that effort will be rewarded and restraint recognized. The gods offer none of this. They offer only consequence. This is not cruelty. It's clarity. Clarity strips away illusions that would otherwise destroy the system. Illusions are expensive. They demand growth, expansion, exception. The Anunnaki allow no exceptions. Exception is imbalance. Imbalance invites correction. Correction is rarely gentle. This harshness gives rise to later misinterpretations. Later cultures reframe the Anunnaki as tyrants, demons, or distant judges devoid of compassion. These interpretations project human expectations onto a non-human logic. The Anunnaki are not moral agents in the modern sense. They do not evaluate intent. They do not weigh guilt. They evaluate sustainability. Intent does not preserve systems. Structure does. This perspective feels alien because it strips away narrative comfort. There is no cosmic justice ensuring that good people are spared and bad people punished. There is only alignment and misalignment. Aligned systems persist. Misaligned systems collapse. Individuals are carried along by these outcomes regardless of virtue. This is deeply unsettling. It removes the illusion of personal exemption. The Anunnaki do not grant exemption. Exemption undermines rule. Rule preserves order. Order delays collapse. Delay is success. This definition of success feels empty to those who seek meaning in progress or transcendence. The Sumerian worldview does not promise transcendence. It promises continuation. Continuation is enough. The Anunnaki are custodians of this modest promise. They do not elevate humanity. They contain it. Containment is misunderstood as oppression. In reality, it is preservation. An uncontained force dissipates itself. Human ambition without boundary does the same. The gods exist to impose boundary without constant violence. Their withdrawal is the least violent form of control. Violence draws attention. Attention fuels resistance. Silence allows systems to internalize limits. This internalization is irreversible. Once a society has learned restraint through collapse, it never fully forgets. Even when prosperity returns, caution lingers. This lingering caution is divine influence made permanent. The Anunnaki no longer need to act because their work has become habit. Habit governs more effectively than fear. Fear fades, habit persists. The gods prefer habit. Habit does not argue. Habit does not demand explanation. Habit simply repeats what works. This repetition is the engine of endurance. From this perspective, divine life is profoundly uncreative. The Anunnaki do not invent, they enforce repetition. Creation is a separate act belonging to earlier powers. The Anunnaki inherit a world already made and ensure it does not unravel. This task is thankless. There is no celebration of maintenance, only complaint when it fails. The gods accept this. They do not seek admiration. Admiration distorts judgment. They seek invisibility. Invisibility preserves function. As the centuries pass, their names are spoken less often. Other gods rise, gods of fertility, of love, of war, gods closer to human desire. These gods are vibrant, present, invoked frequently. They rise and fall with cultures. The Anunnaki remain unchanged beneath them. They outlast pantheons because they are not gods of aspiration. They are gods of limit. Limits do not age. The deepest anxiety of this worldview is not death, it is forgetting. Forgetting invites repetition without learning. The Anunnaki's silence ensures that forgetting is never complete. Consequences reappear. Systems fail in familiar ways. Patterns repeat. Memory is refreshed through loss. This cycle is brutal but effective. It is the price of endurance. The gods accept this price because there is no alternative. A world without limit destroys itself. A world with limit survives imperfectly. The Anunnaki choose survival over perfection. This choice defines everything about their existence. They do not save, they stabilize, they do not redeem, they restrain, they do not inspire, they endure. To live like them is to accept responsibility without relief. It is to act rarely and decisively. It is to withdraw before presence corrupts authority. It is to allow the world to feel the weight of its own choices. This is not a life of glory. It is a life of necessity. And necessity, once accepted, becomes invisible. The Anunnaki vanish not because they are gone, but because they have succeeded. Their silence is the sound of a system holding. Eventually, even the idea of divine absence stops feeling meaningful. When a system has operated long enough without visible intervention, people no longer ask where the gods have gone. They ask instead why things happen the way they do. The question shifts from presence to mechanism, from who governs to what governs, and in that shift the Anunnaki complete their transformation. They are no longer beings one might encounter, they are conditions one lives within. This is the quiet end point of their withdrawal, not disappearance but absorption. Their logic sinks so deeply into the world that it can no longer be separated from it. Cause and effect replace command, structure replaces voice, memory replaces presence. At this stage, divine life is indistinguishable from reality itself. People begin to speak of inevitability as though it were natural, forgetting that inevitability was once enforced. They call collapse cyclical, they call limits practical, they call restraint common sense. What was once divine judgment becomes wisdom, then custom, then assumption. This forgetting is not failure, it is success. A God who must be remembered to function has failed. A God whose work continues without memory has prevailed. The Anunnaki do not require reverence. They require persistence of structure. When structure persists, their role is fulfilled. This fulfillment is not satisfying in any emotional sense. There is no closure, no resolution, no final harmony. The system does not reach perfection. It reaches equilibrium, and equilibrium is always temporary. Temporary is enough. The Sumerian worldview does not promise eternity in the sense of unchanging peace. It promises recurrence. It promises that what breaks can be rebuilt, but only if memory survives the breaking. The Anunnaki are custodians of that memory. Memory in this sense is not recollection. It is encoding. The encoding of limits into practice, of consequence into expectation, of collapse into caution. This encoding shapes everything from architecture to law to daily habit. Cities are built with walls because memory remembers invasion. Canals are maintained obsessively because memory remembers drought and flood. Ritual calendars persist because memory remembers disorder when routine collapsed. None of this requires belief. Belief is optional, structure is not. As belief fades, a strange inversion occurs. People become less fearful of gods and more fearful of failure. They no longer ask what the gods want. They ask what will happen if this continues. That question is far more powerful. It cannot be answered with prayer. It cannot be deferred to authority. It demands observation, restraint, and adjustment. This demand is the final expression of divine governance. The Anunnaki no longer judge directly. They have taught the world how to judge itself. Self-judgment is more severe than divine punishment because it allows no external blame. When systems fail, responsibility becomes diffuse and unavoidable. Everyone is implicated. No sacrifice can deflect consequence. This is the heaviest burden of maturity. A child blames the parent. An adult confronts outcome. The gods withdraw when humanity reaches this threshold, not because humanity has improved morally, but because it has learned to recognize limits without instruction. This recognition is unstable. It can fade. It often does. Prosperity dulls memory. Comfort breeds forgetfulness. The cycle resumes, but each cycle leaves residue. Residue accumulates. Even when lessons are forgotten consciously, they persist unconsciously, in law, in taboo, in habit, in fear. Fear becomes subtle, not fear of gods, but fear of overreach, fear of scale, fear of noise, fear of complexity growing beyond control. These fears shape policy more effectively than theology ever could. The Anunnaki operate within these fears without being named. They are not invoked in debate. They are felt in hesitation. A project delayed, an expansion abandoned, a reform softened, a boundary reinforced. These moments of restraint are divine influence at its most effective. No altar, no offering. No prayer, just pause. Pause is sacred in this worldview. Action is dangerous. Action accelerates consequence. Pause allows recalibration. The gods pause perpetually. Their entire existence is a pause held against collapse. This pause is not passive. It is active restraint, constant vigilance without movement. The Anunnaki do not sleep. They wait. Waiting is not boredom. It is endurance under pressure. Pressure never dissipates. It only shifts. As one system stabilizes, another strains. As one boundary holds, another erodes. The gods remain at the fault lines. Fault lines define stability. They are invisible until they move. The Anunnaki watch these fault lines. They do not prevent movement. They ensure that when movement occurs, it does not erase everything. This is the difference between disaster and extinction. Extinction is unacceptable. Disaster is tolerable. Disaster preserves memory. Extinction erases it. This is why the gods intervene decisively only when collapse threatens to become terminal. Lesser suffering is allowed to persist because it does not threaten continuity. This distinction is merciless but coherent. The gods are not kind, they are consistent. Consistency allows systems to anticipate consequence. Anticipation allows adjustment. Adjustment allows survival. Kindness would introduce unpredictability. Unpredictability destroys trust in structure. Structure must be trusted even when it is harsh. This trust is not emotional, it is pragmatic. People may resent limits, but they rely on them. The Anunnaki exist to ensure that reliance is not betrayed. They do not change rules. They do not suspend consequence. They do not make exceptions. Exception is collapse disguised as mercy. This understanding reframes divine justice entirely. Justice is not fairness. Fairness invites negotiation. Negotiation invites erosion. Justice is alignment with what endures. Endurance is not fair. It does not distribute pain evenly. It does not reward effort proportionally. It simply persists. The gods align with persistence. This alignment makes them appear cold, distant, even hostile to human desire. But desire unchecked is catastrophic. The Anunnaki are hostile to catastrophe, not to humanity. Humanity survives because catastrophe is restrained, not because it is eliminated. This restraint is their life's work. And it is a life without recognition. There are no hymns praising gods who did not act, no monuments to disasters that did not happen, no gratitude for collapses that were delayed. The Anunnaki are thanked only when they fail, when systems break and people seek someone to blame. This misattribution does not trouble them. Blame does not alter outcome. They remain silent. Silence preserves authority. Authority preserved through silence outlasts any narrative. As cultures change, new gods emerge promising intimacy, forgiveness, transformation. These gods speak. They intervene, they comfort, they also fade because comfort cannot sustain systems. Eventually, the old limits reassert themselves beneath new names. Resource exhaustion returns, social strain returns, collapse returns. The Anunnaki never left. They were simply waiting beneath the surface of belief. This waiting is eternal not because time does not affect them, but because time is their medium. They exist wherever accumulation occurs. They are present in slow disasters more than sudden ones, in gradual erosion more than dramatic collapse, in silence more than spectacle. Spectacle distracts, erosion teaches. The gods prefer teaching that cannot be ignored. This preference shapes the emotional tone of the world. Joy becomes cautious. Ambition becomes measured. Hope becomes conditional. This is not despair. It is sobriety. Sobriety is the emotional state that best supports endurance. The Anunnaki cultivate sobriety without instruction. They remove illusions by allowing them to fail. Failure is their most effective teacher. It leaves marks. Marks become memory. Memory becomes restraint. Restraint becomes structure. Structure becomes survival. This chain is never broken. It can be obscured. It can be denied. It can be misunderstood, but it cannot be escaped. The gods do not need to chase humanity. Humanity carries the system with it. Wherever humans build, they recreate limits. Wherever they expand, they rediscover thresholds. Wherever they forget, they remember through loss. The Anunnaki's world follows humanity everywhere. This universality is the final proof of their success. They are no longer tied to a land, a city, or a people. They are tied to structure itself. As long as structure exists, so do they. As long as consequence follows action, their judgment persists. As long as systems strain under excess, their restraint operates. There is no end to this. There is no final apocalypse that resolves the cycle. There is only continuation punctuated by collapse. The gods do not fear this. They are made for it. Their lives are not stories with arcs and resolutions. They are functions without endings. This makes them deeply alien to human imagination. Humans seek narrative closure. The gods offer recurrence. Humans seek meaning. The gods offer mechanism. Humans seek salvation. The gods offer survival. Survival is enough. It must be. Anything more would collapse under its own weight. The Anunnaki accept this limitation fully. They do not hope for better worlds. They ensure this one does not erase itself. That is the sum of their purpose. They wait not for worship, but for thresholds to be crossed. They do not listen for prayers, but for strain. They do not appear to comfort, but to correct, and correction is rare. Because rarity preserves authority. This is why their presence is felt most strongly in hindsight. Only after collapse do people say, "This was inevitable." Only after failure do patterns become clear. The gods do not reveal inevitability in advance. Revelation would invite avoidance without learning. Learning requires consequence. The Anunnaki ensure consequence arrives. Then they withdraw again, as they always have. There is nothing left to reveal after endurance has been understood. No hidden knowledge waits behind the final boundary. No secret mechanism clicks into place that suddenly makes the weight of the world feel lighter. What remains when everything else has been stripped away is recognition. Recognition that the most powerful forces shaping existence are not dramatic, not visible, and not interested in being understood. They operate whether they are named or not. This is where the Anunnaki finally disappear, not into myth, not into denial, but into inevitability so complete that even the idea of them begins to feel unnecessary. And that is the point. Their success was never meant to feel satisfying. It was meant to feel unavoidable. By the time a system no longer requires gods to threaten it into obedience, divine work is finished. What persists afterward is not presence, but pressure. Not command, but consequence. Not revelation, but repetition. The Anunnaki do not stand at the center of the world. They stand at its breaking points. They exist where excess accumulates, where noise overwhelms structure, where growth outpaces memory. They are not creators, redeemers, or companions. They are stabilizers, and stabilizers are rarely loved. Love seeks closeness. Authority requires distance. Everything about their way of life reflects this truth. They eat not for pleasure, but for maintenance. They rest not for comfort, but for preservation. They withdraw not out of disinterest, but out of discipline. They act rarely because action is dangerous. They wait because waiting preserves clarity. Their silence is not absence, it is containment. To understand them is to abandon the expectation that power must announce itself. Real power does not argue, it does not persuade, it does not explain. It waits for systems to reveal what they have become. This is why their judgments feel so heavy when they finally arrive. They do not interrupt momentum, they conclude it, and once concluded, they withdraw again. Nothing about this worldview promises happiness, nothing guarantees fairness, nothing assures rescue. What it offers instead is coherence, a universe that responds predictably to imbalance even if that response is harsh. Harshness is preferable to randomness. Randomness cannot be learned from. The Anunnaki preside over a world where learning is compulsory, where forgetting is punished not by wrath but by repetition, where collapse is not an ending but a reminder that limits exist whether acknowledged or not. They are not offended by disbelief. They are not weakened by neglect. They do not fade when forgotten. They persist wherever systems exist, in economies that overextend, in cities that grow louder than they can sustain, in technologies that outpace restraint, in societies that confuse expansion with stability. Everywhere thresholds are ignored, the same corrections emerge. Different names, same outcomes. The Anunnaki do not need temples because systems have become their temples. They do not need offerings because consequence has replaced ritual. They do not need stories because patterns repeat loudly enough on their own. And yet stories remain necessary not to appease gods but to slow forgetting. That is what this narration has been about. Not mythology as fantasy, but mythology as memory technology. A way of preserving hard-earned lessons in forms that outlast individual lives. The Anunnaki are not beings to worship. They are reminders of what happens when restraint fails. They are the reason endurance matters more than brilliance, the reason repetition outlasts innovation, the reason silence often governs more effectively than command. They lived within limits because limits preserve worlds. They withdrew because presence corrupts authority. They waited because waiting reveals truth, and in that waiting they shaped a reality where the most important forces do not speak at all. If this kind of slow, careful exploration resonates with you, if it helps you think differently or simply helps your mind settle rather than race, then take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment as well. I'd genuinely like to know where you're listening from in the world, especially if you're listening late at night. And for now, let the silence do what it has always done best, not reveal, but hold.